He's always been very kind and cordial to me. We're glad that his dad, Hugh, from out of town, is with him today. And I think your family is still on the carpet today. Ty is married and has two girls. Funneling out some money at Oklahoma Christian right now. But anyway, we're really glad that Ty has come to be part of our service today, and I want you to know that he's a fine man, and we will hear some good lessons. So I want to just turn it over to him and let him have his time. Thank you, Ty.
I'm really glad to be here because I was lost about 3 or 4 miles that way, so I'm glad to be here. Couldn't figure out how to navigate the construction. Trying to get my youngest daughter to come with me this morning, but she had an all-day dance competition yesterday, and so she woke up and she laid back on the couch and fell asleep. So I could only recruit my dad. He gets up early anyway. She didn't have any work. Glad to be here. I'm glad to see that the church is doing well everywhere that I get to visit. I love seeing especially young people who are striving to do what God wants us to do. I think the coming generations, I've found with all the work that I do in evangelism, are really looking for answers to life. We know that there's a lot of places that they can look, but we know that if they're going to find real answers, they're going to come from a relationship with God. Because that gives you that full and abundant life that a lot of people are looking for. Often we call that happiness. But it really has to do with peace. It has to do with joy. It has to do with purpose. And so I thought for a Bible class this morning, I would pick a lesson that I've done before that I think is really helpful for us as servants of God. We're going to be looking a little bit at the life of Moses, and that's why I call it a reluctant servant. I know that to the Jewish people, to Israel, Moses was one of their true heroes of the faith. You have Abraham and you have Moses. Moses didn't want to do a lot of what he did early on. And so I think that speaks a lot to us, because I think there are times we go through life and we want to do more, but there are some things that get in the way. There are some, I'm not sure, I think Moses' problem is one that we suffer from sometimes: lack of confidence, lack of knowing really what it is you're doing, the importance of it. And so we're going to try and deal with some of those issues this morning. Look at the truth about serving. According to George Barna, who does a lot of research, he said 6 out of 10 believers have no sense of what they want to achieve or become. 6 out of 10 have no spiritual goals for their life. They're just kind of wandering along from day to day. So what are they doing? What are they accomplishing? They haven't really set any goals for their spiritual development. They failed to set standards against which they measure their growth. And so how do they know whether they're accomplishing something in their spiritual life or not? Barna also reports that only about 10% of people listed as a goal serve other people and having a personal ministry. That's within the church. I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking about within the church. Only about 10% of people really feel like they have a purpose. Besides coming Sunday morning, filling up a pew, hearing a lesson, and then going home. They are really connected with some sort of service in the church. So Jim Woodruff, in Aroma of Christ, had this. He said, a person comes to be like what he loves and grows to be like what he worships. And I think that's true. I think that's very true. If you want to be the best basketball player that there is, Who are you going to choose? Hopefully you're going to choose Kevin Durant because he's local, right? You're not going to choose one of those other guys. But you're going to set that as a goal. And as a young man, what are you going to do? You're going to get out on the court and you're going to practice being like Kevin Durant. Now, what are the odds of you doing that? They're not very good, right? I mean, unless you grow to be 6'10" or something like that, you're going to have some things against you. But what are you doing? You are setting your goal and you're working towards it every day. You're trying to practice your dribbling. You're trying to practice your shot. You're trying to practice getting better at that. And yet, a lot of times spiritually, we don't have something that we're setting as a goal. I want to be a more patient person. I want to be a better husband as a Christian. I want to be a better father as a Christian. I want to be more understanding with people. And if that's in your mindset, guess what? I think God's going to give you a lot of opportunity to practice it. That's one of the reasons I almost quit praying for patience, because I found every time I prayed for it, God gave me a chance to work on it. And I didn't quite always like that. But we become like what we love, and we grow to be like what we worship. What he means by that is what we put on our altar is what we're going to worship. That may be a TV, right? It's in the center of our home. Everything focuses around it. And they say, well, I don't want to spend that much time, but does it suck a lot of time? That's something we have to consider, and I think that's what Jim Woodruff was after. God really wants us to have spiritual goals. He wants us to have spiritual goals. And in order for us to do that, we have to do some things. I think Moses was a man without goals. Early on in his life, he was a man without goals. He was reluctant to serve God because he really didn't know what it would take of him to serve him. And so Moses became reluctant to serve God in great ways. God kept having to kind of prod him, kept having to open his vision up to Moses so that Moses could get an idea of it. So just like Moses, we're often reluctant servants of God. But there are some things that we can do to help our reluctancy. If we humble ourselves before God, it removes three things we're going to talk about: our excuses, our fears, and our compromises in our service to God. I think these are three things that are really, really strong in each of us. Because I'm telling you, I'm preaching this because I understand it, because it affects me. And I hope it affects you in some ways, and we can work through that this morning. Reluctance, simply defined, is a lack of enthusiasm or a measure of resistance, an unwillingness to do something or commit to it. What happens if you're reluctant in your marriage? Doesn't go well, does it? If you're reluctant to say I do, then that relationship probably doesn't continue, does it? We want people who are committed when we say I do to a marriage. If your boss says, I've got a project for you and I want you to head it up, and you say, okay. How much confidence does he have in you to head that up? And so God, I think, demands the same sort of thing from us. He doesn't want our reluctance. Turn, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is going to be our main text this morning. We're going to look at verses 24 through 26. Hebrews 11, 24 through 26. Somebody mind reading that for me?
By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value to the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward.
Thank you. Okay. That's where Moses ended up. That's not where he started. Right? That's where he found he was. And so, but we want to look, how did he get there? How did he get there? Number one, he refused the world. Acts 7:22, he was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and his deeds, it says about Moses. When Stephen is preaching there, he's talking about Moses. Now, that's not the Moses that we know. Moses we know says what? I can't speak. I need somebody to help me. We're going to talk about that when we get to excuses here in just a moment. But it says he was instructed in all the wisdom. He was a smart person. He had all the education you could possibly want. And he was mighty in words and deeds. There was a 40-year period that Moses indulged in the pleasures of living in Pharaoh's household. 40 years. It's a pretty long time. That's a third of his life, isn't it? He was enjoying the good life. He was enjoying everything there was. Yet, there was a maturation period here, wasn't there? According to what we read in Hebrews, he grew up. And at some point, he said what? He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's significant. How many of us, if we had everything we wanted, say, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to make myself nothing, and I'm going to have nothing, and I'm going to be disgraced. So that what? What's your purpose, Moses? I'm not sure he knew at that time, did he? He just knew he was a Hebrew and he needed to get back to being a Hebrew. He needed to quit living in the lap of luxury and being called something that was not his heritage. And I think that's all he knew at that point. And so he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He deliberately denounced privilege and pleasures in a royal palace. This great refusal of Moses consisted in a firm resolution in mind. You don't change your status like this unless you're sure that something different will be better. Something different, you can serve a greater purpose in life. You ever know anybody who late in life says, I'm going to quit this job that I've had. It's a good job, but I'm going to go do something different. I'm going to go do something different. Why? Because I feel like it is the right thing to do at this time of life. And we look at him and say, are you crazy? What is wrong with you? Don't give up a good job to go and do something that you can't really see the significance of. It's going to be a harder life. It's going to be a lot more difficult. You don't do that, right? But that's what the scriptures tells us that Moses did. It was by faith that Moses refused, clinging in his heart to the divine promise, the apprehension of things not seen by the outward eye. He was confident of the expectation of his reward. And when you do that, you gain perspective. I think that's one of the things that our current culture and our current world tries to squeeze on us, doesn't it? Just think about today. Don't think about perspective. Don't think about what's going to happen because of the decisions you make tomorrow. Just think about today. Just think about what you want. Burger King motto, have it your way. When? Right now. That is pervasive in everything we see in advertising, isn't it? Do it now, before you think about it. Do it now before you consider the consequences or the long-term effect of it. And so our world is squeezing that message on us in many ways. But Moses said what? I'm giving that up for the long-term goal. And as Christians, we need to understand we've got to refuse the world. We've got to understand that eternal life can't be traded for anything in this world. Because you know what? It's a bad exchange. It's a bad exchange. Anything that you could have in this world pales in comparison to being able to be in the presence of God for eternity. right? So what do? We have to refuse the world. Secondly, he encountered opposition. Hebrews 11:25, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I want you to look for a moment at the excuses of Moses. The inconvenience. If you go back to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus 3:10, Moses says, "Who am I that I should go?" 3:13, "What do I know? Who are you?" Exodus 4:1, "I am not credible before the people." Exodus 4:10, "I am a poor speaker." I mentioned that before. Exodus 4:13, "Please just get someone else to do it." Does that sound like us? I think those excuses sound pretty familiar to me. When I don't want to do something, I'm pretty good at coming up with a reason that I shouldn't be the one to do it. Moses, I relate to, because he had excuses, a bunch of them. 5 times here in just a couple of chapters. But there's a fear here, a fear of Pharaoh. And I think when you fear something, it's very easy to tell God, I don't want to do what you want me to do. I'm not going to put myself out on the line because I'm afraid of what will happen. As an evangelist, that's one of the things I'm constantly trying to get people to overcome. Well, if I speak up about God, how will people respond? Tell them, that's not your concern. That's God's concern, isn't it? Our job is to just mention Him, to plant a seed. God's the one who's supposed to give growth or increase. He's the one that has to deal with the person's eternal place of living for eternity, right? He's the one that has to decide that, not me. And so a lot of times fear comes in. And I want you to look at Moses. Turn to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus 2, we're going to start in verse 11. Moses' fear was of Pharaoh. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their heavy burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill us as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Moses' second phase of his life begins in fear. Being unsure of his future and trying to flee from confrontation. I think that is a real second phase of our life many times. Okay, I've tried to give God all the excuses. He doesn't seem to be accepting any of them. He keeps presenting opportunities to me, even though I'm telling him I can't do this. So what then? What's going to happen to me if I start trying to be a real Christian? If I start trying to serve people as God wants me to? What's going to happen? What if it costs me my job? What if it costs me my friends? What if it even maybe costs me some family members who won't talk to me anymore? Kind of where Moses is, isn't he? Oh, this thing that I've done is known. I thought I was standing up for my people, and now what? They're not even accepting me. I'm afraid of Pharaoh, so I'm going to run away. This is a man who would some years later in Exodus 14:13 say, "Fear not, Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. Is that the same guy? Yeah. Just a few chapters later, about 40 years later in his life, who's saying, fear not. Well, you were a coward back then. You ran away. But he's going through that second phase of life that is transforming him. And he's realizing that fear does not produce the righteousness of God. And so although fear caused Moses to run to the desert, he did not allow it to stifle or kill his growth. He's still maturing. Oh, let me go back just a minute before I put that one up. So Moses goes through excuses. He goes through fear. The third thing he goes through is trying to compromise. He has to deal with a man who continues to try and get him to compromise the will of the Lord. That's Pharaoh. Pharaoh constantly tries to get Moses to compromise his integrity with God. Exodus chapter 8, verse 28. So Pharaoh said, I will let you go sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you must not go very far away. Moses answered, we will go with our young and with our old and with our sons and with our daughters and with our flocks and with our herds. Exodus chapter 10, verse 9. But that was too much for Pharaoh, who said, not so. Go now, ye that are men, and serve the Lord, but leave everybody else here. And then in Exodus 10:24, Pharaoh called Moses and said, go serve the Lord, your little ones also may go with you, only let your flocks and your herds remain behind. You might think, well, what's the harm in that? They're just trying to find a workable solution, except what? Everything that Pharaoh is trying to get them to do is going to get them to go, and then what? They're going to have to come back. It's okay to live your life in service of God for a little bit, but I'm going to hold on to things that are going to draw you back. Doesn't that sound like the world? You can practice your faith in this way, and that's okay, but don't go too far. We want to have our hooks on you so we can draw you back to where we want you to be. Don't become a zealot for God. Don't become too passionate for him. Moderate it. That's compromise. And Moses, at this phase in his life, says, no. God does not compromise on his side. He tells us what to do, and we do it. Why? Because he is the authority. We are just the servants. And so Pharaoh tries to get Moses to come back to a middle ground on his faith. And Moses has grown enough to realize there is no middle ground with Pharaoh. There is no middle ground with the world. If you love the world, you're what? You're enemies of God, John tells us. You can't be in the middle. It doesn't work. And so opposition to what we know we should do from self and others is always going to bring fear. If he had agreed to that, he would have gone back to phase 2. He would have regressed. But Moses chose to work on those fears over the next 40 years so that by the time he returns to Egypt, he is a mature servant of God. Acts 7:36 and 38 says this man led them out, performing signs and wonders in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. He received living oracles to give to us. Guess what? Here's a man that is prepared for God to speak through him to the people. And eventually that's going to bring what? The law. There's going to be a guiding light for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, for the Jewish people. And so finally, as you look at this pyramid, he refused the world, he encountered opposition from it, but he chose God. Go back, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 26, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. He was joining a downtrodden nation of slaves, whose only riches were the promises of an invisible God. That doesn't sound like a good exchange, right? Here's real wealth that gives you all the pleasures and things that you want, or here's an invisible promise that requires tremendous faith to hold on to. And you're going to leave this for that? Our empirical nature, our empirical science tells us what? Don't believe in anything that you can't see. Everything has to be explained through eyes, hands, senses of some type. And if it can't be explained through that, it's not real. But Moses began to believe it, and it changed him. When he was 40 years old, according to Acts 7:23, he chose to align himself with God's people. But when he was 80, he was prepared to act. Now, I'm hoping most of us don't wait till 80, because that means my dad wouldn't even have started yet. But there are periods of life, right? There's an early period where he's enjoying the things of this world. But during that next period, he's maturing. He's realizing what is really valuable, what's important. And by the time he's 80, he's ready to lead the people of God out of Egypt. He's ready for that calling that God has given. He's seeking it out. This is not the same man that we saw running away from Pharaoh. He's saying what? Don't fear. Stand firm. God will deliver us. We need to have that sort of growth as well. Why was he changed? The simple answer is faith. A God-energized faith. Do we have that? Are we working towards that? That's why I think it's so important what Barna says, that most people don't have a goal spiritually that they're working towards. We need to have a growth of our faith as a primary goal for our spiritual life. And if we do that, like I mentioned about patience and such, you start praying to God for that, you start working on that, God's going to give you opportunities to demonstrate it. He's going to give you opposition. He's going to give you encounters with things in this world, because guess how faith grows? It doesn't grow by being enclosed in our house away from the world so that the world can't get to us. It grows from being engaged with the world so that as we have choices to make, we always have two choices. I'm either going to do what the world wants me to do, or I'm going to do what God wants me to do. And every time you choose God, guess what? Your faith grows. It gets energized. You believe God's promises a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Or if you choose the world, God seems further, more distant, and more distant from you. Same choices Moses had to make. Choices haven't changed in all these years. By the time Moses had lived in the desert for 40 years, he was relying on God for his food every day. He was relying on God to provide. He is totally a different person than when he left Egypt at age 40, when everything was provided for him by his position. In our climate in Oklahoma City, there's a lot of layoffs going on with the energy area. We've had a few people in our congregation be touched by that. Luckily, God has provided for most of them, and it hadn't affected us greatly. But I'm telling you, some of the people that I've encountered that have lost their job, God will provide. That is so good to hear, because the world tells us you should do everything you can to protect your job. You've got to worry about it. Not if you're trusting in the God who provides. Did you get that job, or was it an opportunity placed before you by God? We have those choices every day of our life. What choices are we making? Are we choosing God? Moses is no longer a reluctant servant. Instead, he's a willing servant of God who does everything he can for Jehovah and everything he can for the people of Israel. Turn over, if you will, to Numbers chapter 12. Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, I think is one of the greatest summary verses about Moses that we have. Here was this guy who had excuses. Here was this guy who was fearful. Here was this guy who kind of went through trying to compromise with God. And what was the result? What did people say of him after he was gone? Numbers chapter 12, verse 3 says what? Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. That's a pretty good summary verse. What does that really mean? That means he humbled himself so that God could work through him. That's all it takes for God. They say, I don't have a lot of talents. Are you humble? Can God work through you to accomplish things that you may be the only person that he can work through in the area where you are? Realize that? You may be the only person who knows people that you know. Nobody else in here has any contact with them. Nobody else here can say a word for God to them, except for you. Are you humble enough to allow God to work through you? I think that's why this is such a great verse. I think if you could say that about any person, that's the greatest compliment that you can give them. They were a humble servant of God. They let God work through them more than any person I've ever known. So I think that's a great compliment to Moses where he wound up, because he chose God. He refused the world and chose God in the latter part of his life. He saw God do things through him that he could have never believed would have occurred. Through his humility, he gained perspective and faith in God to become a great servant of the Most High. So my question for you is, are we reluctant servants? Are we reluctant servants? Let me spend the last 5 or 6 minutes that we have together giving you some ideas on maybe how we're reluctant servants and what we need to do in order to quit being reluctant servants. Number one, we need to refuse the world. And as we refuse the world, it's going to create time and it's going to remove excuses. Time is probably our most precious commodity, isn't it? In our world today, somebody asks us for our time, you got to really think about that, right? It's precious to us. What about when God asks us for our time? Think about that. Think about what you're really asking me to do. Is it what we are committed to? If not, maybe the world has creeped in a little bit more into our lives than we think it has. If we're too busy for God, then we're too busy. We should be ready to accept it. Now, we may need some time. We may need some training. We may need some things like Moses did. We may need a maturation period to really be able to fully understand what God is asking us to do. That doesn't mean we don't get started today and let him start working on us for what he wants us to be. But if we're going to do this, to serve, you must deny self so you have time to do what God is asking. If your calling amounts to attendance at a few religious activities, being a nice person, reading the scripture while your whole life is wrapped up in a worldly pursuit and gains, time to examine your calling. If it's not producing fruit for the kingdom, then what is it doing? It's withering and dying on the vine. And so we need to understand the number one excuse that people always give for why they're not involved in the work of the Lord is what? Time. I don't have the time. But go to the Thunder game, go to OU game, OSU game, right? You always find time for that. That's an indication sometimes of our priorities. Moses was there. He understands that. But he says what? Let your faith mature, and you can do great things for God. Secondly, you need to learn the value of things of God above all others. As you encounter opposition, it creates resolution, and it removes fear. You would think that this would be true, that it would create fear. As you encounter opposition, sometimes I wonder, and this is not an indictment of anybody's prayer in here, but sometimes we pray, thank you, God, for letting us be able to worship free. And I sometimes wonder if that's a good thing. I'm glad that we get to choose who we worship. But if you look in the early church, what caused them to spread the gospel all over the world? Persecution, and then they went all over preaching it. You know why? Because they had to decide whether they were really serious about their faith or not. If somebody says, are you a Christian? And you know the answer is going to get you sewn up in a sack and lighted on fire, put in the Colosseum. You're going to lose your job and not have a way to make a living for your family. You got to really think about, do I believe these things? I don't think that we need to have persecution, but I think not having some persecution kind of allows us to remain a little bit lazy in our faith because we don't decide how important it is. And so we need to understand that sometimes encountering opposition creates resolution. We've already thought about what our answer is going to be if somebody asks us. We're ready for it. And that produces confidence rather than fear. Every decision we make should be weighted against our service for God. Turn, if you will, to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Fear is often the result of distrust. General George Patton said this, I learned very early in my life never to take counsel of my fears. They'll keep you from doing what you know is right. And so Isaiah said in chapter 12, verse 2, Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. Deuteronomy 31:8, it is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Fear is a big issue for many people. And you know what we're afraid of? Most of the time, we're afraid of things that have never happened. Right? That haven't happened yet. We're afraid of them. So we're paralyzed by things that don't happen. Look, my suggestion is, if I can give you anything good this morning, be afraid of things that have happened in your life already. But be resolute about determining that they're not going to create fear. Don't worry about things that haven't happened yet. But trust God and believe in Him. And lastly, choosing God creates zeal and it removes compromise. Trying to compromise with God kills our zeal for good works. But God, can't I do it this way? Can't we just meet in the middle ground somewhere? Can't I have a little say-so in how we do this? And guess what? He gets to answer no. Because he's the one who's made all the sacrifices for what we are enjoying. We didn't do anything to inherit our own salvation except what? Being obedient to his will. But he's the one who poured out Jesus into a human body, sent him to this earth, watched him be beat, spit upon, and be put on a cross. Guess what? He doesn't have to compromise. It's his wealth that we are enjoying in Christ. So I think choosing God creates zeal. It removes that desire to want to compromise. Why do we want to compromise? Well, because we want to have a little say-so. We don't like somebody dictating how we do things. But understand this, God tells us what he tells us because he wants what is best for us. Every single time. I don't know a human being who I can say that about. My wife loves me. I don't think every single time she tells me something, she has my best interest at heart. Just part of who we are. We struggle with that. But God does. So service to God cannot be compromised. If we never see these things accomplished through our lives, we can't explain by our own strength. Our faith will be extremely weak, and our reluctance to serve God will be great. When we choose to be a servant, we surrender the right to decide who and when we will serve. That's that humility. We become available, and we become vulnerable. Remember what John wrote down in Revelation 3:16. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. If we're lukewarm in our service to God, we're not really accomplishing anything for ourselves or for God. Because we're not being who we could be. Kind of like that middle part of Moses where he was learning. He wasn't really doing anything for anybody. We've got to decide. There is an importance in seizing our opportunities. We see them all the time. We've got to take advantage of them. We've got to take advantage of them. It is what God needs us to be. And so I hope that through examining some of these things, giving you some ideas this morning, if anybody is being reluctant in their service to God, that these will get rid of some of those excuses, get rid of some of those fears, get rid of our desire to try and compromise with God, because we can become great servants of him just like Moses did. If we will work through those issues, we can be a great, great servant of God. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ted.